When my son Eli was 9 years old, I somehow wound up, thank you. Which one do I click? There's so many buttons. Thank you. I wound up becoming his Cub Scout leader, which was sort of a strange thing for me to step into that role into an organization that was that rigid and required a uniform, because as an artist, one of the few things that I would ever do is wear a uniform, especially one quite that sexy. But I did, and I stepped into that role and found that it was an opportunity for me to guide some kids and to really empower some kids in a way I had never really understood was possible. And so the first thing that I thought to myself is, these kids are 9 and 10 years old, and is there a way that I can really empower them? Is there something that I can do, that I have these 9 and 10-year-old boys, is there something that I can offer them that would really give them a sense of empowerment and that would really sort of put them in a world that was not something that they were used to? So what I thought to do was to ask them, well, what do you think that you can do to improve your community? And as a 9 and 10-year-old, what is your community? And their answer was that for them, their community was their school. So not knowing much about what it means to be a 9 or 10-year-old, I thought the best way to understand what they need is to ask them. And so they explained to me that what was missing from their community was that there was no place for them to sit in their schoolyard when they would go out for recess. Something as simple as a place to sit and gather with their friends was something that didn't exist. So I took the 5 or 6 boys to the beach one afternoon, and I sat down and I said, well, what would that look like? What would it look like to create a place where you and your friends could sit? And so they started to make some sketches. Is it working? Yeah? Cool. Oh, wait, went ahead. This is their original sketches. And so it was amazing to me that by explaining to them what purpose was, what it meant to create something that not only looked cool, but actually had function. And so the idea that they presented was that they felt that there were some kids that were more shy, and there's some kids that were more outgoing, and they wanted the design to be able to incorporate both of those kinds of kids. So they created the slide is behind me. They created the designs, and they narrowed it down to these two. The one on the left, the idea was that when the kids were sitting on the inside of that shape, that they would be able to talk to each other, and they would be for the more sociable kids. And the kids who were perhaps more introverted or who just wanted to be quiet during that time could sit on the outside, and they would face out. Now, this is coming from the minds of 9 and 10-year-olds, and it just sort of blew my mind that they could be that socially aware that this was something that was relevant to them. This was something that really mattered. So we continued on. Whoops. We continued on to a black slide. Oh, dear. And we went to the location, and we scouted the location, and they said that they thought the best place was between these 2 trees because it was often hot while they were outside at recess, and if they were going to be able to sit somewhere, they would want to be able to sit in the shade. So eventually we plopped in the idea, and they approved this. This was based on this yin-yang concept that they wanted. And as time went on, we actually were able to raise enough money and create these benches that have been there since 2009. The most remarkable part for me was we couldn't get the school and the assistant superintendent to agree to clear the space. We needed the turf to be dug up, and we needed the space to be available for the installation to happen. Week after week, and email after email, and phone call after phone call, I was getting absolutely nowhere. So one day, this is an early cell phone technology world, we went for a hike, and I took the kids in the woods, and I said, you know what, let's create a script. You make the phone call. So they wrote a script, they sat down, and on speakerphone, they all had their parts. We called the assistant superintendent. They explained what they needed and that we weren't getting the response that we wanted. And at 8 o'clock the next morning, it was amazing to me. I got an email that said, we've approved this, we're going to go ahead and do it, and let's schedule it, and let's move ahead. And then when the kids actually showed up, thank you, when the kids showed up at the assistant superintendent's office, I sent them by themselves. I stood in the hallway and I waited for them to come out. And the receptionist who I spoke to later told me that after 20-something years of her working in that office in the district, that was the first time in her life that children had ever walked through that door. And that just blew my mind, that was off limits for those kids. And I just asked myself, if I could empower those 5 or 6, 9 and 10-year-olds to step up and do something that's significant, well, what else can kids do? And what else do kids need? And what can we do to empower them just to be able to be better people, to be able to serve in a greater capacity? So a couple years later, I teach photography as part of my life. I teach at Suffolk Community College. And my teaching is very student-initiated in terms of what projects that we take on. And I had a student come to me and introduce a project that I had never heard of called the Help Portrait, started by a photographer in Tennessee, which is now an international project. And the basic idea of this project is that in one day in the first week in December, photographers from all over the world, anyone with a camera is a photographer, makes a portrait of someone that they identify as being in need. In need could be someone had a bad day to someone who is on their deathbed and anything in between. So my students decided they really liked this project, and they as a class wanted to take on the project together. And so I asked them to identify a need or identify an area that they felt that they wanted to bring awareness to. And we did the project 3 years in a row with 3 different classes, all every time initiated by another student who would come and say, hey, did you ever hear about the Help Portrait? And in the 3rd year, we wound up, at their request, we wound up in a drug rehab center. And this was, for me, my first experience of coming into contact with the world of addiction and substance abuse and rehabilitation. And a significant turning point in my life was when I wound up at a particular facility that was carved out for women who were either pregnant or who were young mothers of young children. And in that visit to that facility, I was given a tour of the nursery and saw babies, infants, who were born addicted and who were detoxing in their first week of their life. And something just hit me at that point that said, this is so unfair. There's something that's got to be done. We've got to get the word out. And this was before we started to really recognize or publicize the degree of heroin that's flowing through Long Island. And I just felt it's time to bring a message out. It's time to bring awareness to this issue. And out of that, the Just Like Me project was born. Just Like Me is you can see it's a booth that we created that is a facsimile of a very dilapidated, nasty building. And inside the booth, the students are invited to enter one at a time. It's a soundproof booth, so they're disappearing into their own world. There's no judgment. There's no one looking at them. There's no one wondering what's going on inside. And inside the booth is a photograph that I had taken of a woman named Bridget, who I had met at that Phoenix House facility, who had at that time a 2-year-old and was doing incredibly well. And Bridget volunteered to really get involved with Just Like Me and to offer her voice and her face. The idea was to have an adolescent walk inside this booth and come as close as possible to actually having an interaction with someone who was in the throes of recovery. Inside the booth, I can describe to you, there is a photograph of Bridget that was done really to make her look like a cover model. And she's a beautiful girl. And the photograph itself is printed on a one-way mirror so that the person who is looking at her is also able to see sort of through her and see themselves at the same time. And once they walk into the booth, there's a switch under their feet that triggers an audio recording of an interview of Bridget sharing her life. And it's a sort of a like, how could that be? How is it possible that someone that's that beautiful, who's sort of standing right in front of me, could have been living on the street with nothing, just shooting 25 to 30 needles a day, turned to prostitution? How could it be possible? And the idea and the name Just Like Me was born out of that very idea, where we sat down with a group of women at that Phoenix House facility, and somebody asked the question, well, what's the difference between you and somebody else that doesn't get hooked on heroin? What is it about you that's different, and what is it about you that's the same? And one of the young ladies raised her hand and she said, she's just like me, she's just lucky. And that was the only difference. So it really started to engage something in me that just a bigger question. And the idea at that point of making something very private public was born in me. And finding people who are willing to share their story and not do it in a way that's sensationalized, not do it in a way that is melodramatic or big or violent, but just doing it in a way that's honest and sincere and sober, and then creating art that carries that message, not in a way that's loud and brash and listen, but in a more quiet way that more insists on attention, that insists on involvement, that insists that someone can actually stand there and say, you know what, maybe we should be having a bigger conversation. Maybe we should be having a more difficult conversation. And if this person has the courage to do so, then I have to find that courage in myself to be able to do the same. In Time magazine, this was in November of this past year, the level of anxiety, depression, and suicide in college students specifically in this country is off the charts. It is so scary. It is so scary. Here's some quick statistics. Half of college students felt overwhelming anxiety. This was a poll of 80,000 students across the country. More than 1/3 of college students felt so depressed it was hard to function. Suicide rate among young adults ages 15 to 24 has tripled since 1950, and 12 people ages 15 to 24 will commit suicide today. We are doing something wrong. We're doing something really wrong, and we need to find a way to get it right. I quickly read this to you. This is a statement from a librarian at a library where we ran the I Matter project, which I'm going to have to leave you to introduce yourself out in the hallway. We have a big exhibit out there, and it's an interactive piece that's going on. The I Matter project is the work we're currently engaged in, and this will give you an idea of how powerful it is. This is from a teen librarian at Comac Library talking about a boy named Mikey. I'm sorry, this is about Hunter. I've known Hunter since the day I became a librarian 10 years ago. He's shy and quiet and only ever said one word to me, hello. When Hunter signed up for the I Matter project, I was excited, but also nervous as to how he would be able to speak about the project in public. I was overwhelmed at the person he became over the 4-month span of fundraising, attending community meetings, and speaking, and really taking charge, along with his best friend, Mikey, as to how they were going to fundraise. In Hunter's own words, he told me, "You listening to our ideas made them happen. It's like we were the CEOs of our own company." To hear that from someone who only ever said one word made me feel like we've already succeeded in our mission to make these teens feel like they matter. When I met Mikey, he could not look at me. And Hunter the same. To these two kids, all they had with each other, they could not make eye contact. At the end of the 4-month process, Hunter and Mikey stood before 200 people and addressed the audience and explained about what their involvement was and what it meant for them to succeed, to raise $10,000 to be able to create the project. It was just mind-blowing. And I asked myself again, okay, how do we empower our kids? How do we empower our kids? And if through this process, through art is one of those modalities, I just kept feeling we have to ask. When the students came out of the Just Like Me booth, they would come out and they would answer a short series of questions, either with me or with a social worker. And when they were opening up their hearts, every single kid, it didn't matter who they were, it didn't matter what clique they were in, every kid, when they sat down, and I asked them finally, why are you so open with me? Why are you willing to pour your heart out to me that you don't know me? And the overwhelming response was the same, because you asked. And I just think we have to ask. You know, we really have to find a way, and if it's too uncomfortable or if it's too difficult, we have to break through that. We have to break through that barrier in some way. I just want to let you know that Touro College has agreed to house the iMatter project starting in March. We don't have an exact date, but we will have a completed project there. The new edition of it is shown out in the lobby. You can see where it's headed. You can see the older version of it headed also there. And Touro has also agreed that we're going to host a forum at the college so that we can start to open up this dialogue between generations. That is my quest, that is my mission, is to break down the wall between my generation and my kids' generation, move from judgment to curiosity, open up these doors of communication, and just find a way to give them some power. Thank you so much.